In the previous lecture, lecture 6, we were looking at the ng app and how it got linked together with our app.js module with the same name, as well as in index.html, we were looking at ng controller and how that got linked together with name calculator controller, again in app.js. And this linking or this binding was done for us by Angular. Sometimes when you're first beginning with a framework like Angular, or really any other framework, some of these things can become a little bit intimidating simply because it's a little bit of a magic as to what's going on here. How does this ng app attribute end up with this name calculator module connected and bound together? So I find it that sometimes it's helpful to take a step back and just to figure out how does these things work, kind of pulling the curtain back and see what's behind the magic. And the truth of the matter is there's really nothing magical about this, and what we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to see how does Angular able to find this particular ng app attribute and how is it able to deal with it. Let's go ahead and minimize this. And we have here a folder lecture 07 and just an index.html inside of it. So we're looking at lecture 07 folder, which is located in fullstack-course 5 examples folder. And we're looking at a very simple index.html page. So it's got a body, it's got an h1, and it has a div with a section and an article in here. And a div has an ID with the name target. And I already set up my browser sync such that it's actually showing me what is inside this HTML page. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use JavaScript to try to select this whole chunk of HTML. And that's fairly easy and we know how to do that. Let's go ahead and actually do it straight inside HTML. We'll write a script tag, and inside the script tag we'll do, let's say, var element, and we'll say document.getElement by ID. Let's go ahead and close the file browser so you can see a little bit better. And we'll say target. Okay, so that's the element. We've selected this element right here, and really we've selected everything, the entire DOM structure that is underneath this div element. So we can actually console.log this and see that we were successful. Let's go ahead and do console.log, and we'll do element. And when we save it, it should pop out here. Right here pops out is that we see our div target. And if you open it up here in Chrome, you'll see that we actually have much more than just the div tag itself. We have all the things underneath of it as well. Now, what happens to our HTML page if right here, instead of putting, class or something else standard, what happens if I put something like greeting equals hello? So if I save this, let's see what happens to the HTML page. Well, nothing really happened. Why is that? Well, the reason that is because greeting is not a standard HTML attribute. And the browser, the software that runs the browser, tries to interpret every one of these tags and every one of these attributes, and it doesn't really know what to do with this greeting attribute. And therefore, it just ignores it. However, there are methods and functions in JavaScript to let us get at the actual attribute and at the value. So for example, we could go ahead and say element.getAttribute and give it the name of the attribute, which is greeting. So if we actually surround this with a console.log, so we could see what it actually is getting, and we'll save it. Once it refreshes the browser right here, you'll see that what we got was hello. And hello is the value of the greeting attribute. So you can see now that any attribute you place inside of an element, you're able to get at that attribute and also to get at the value that that attribute contains. So let's go ahead and actually replace it and replace this greeting one with ng app equals, let's say, my test app. Now, ng app attribute doesn't mean anything in this context because we didn't even load AngularJS into this HTML page. However, just like the greeting, we're able to take this ng app attribute and get the value of it just like before. So if we save that, you'll see that the value is my test app. But there's more to it than that. We can, if we want to, suppose we are the AngularJS authors of the AngularJS framework, and we want to find where is in our HTML an attribute, or an element I should say, with an attribute ng-app such that we need to bind our module to that particular element and everything below it. And the same goes for the ng controller. So let's go ahead and try that. And we could do that very simply by doing this. Let's go ahead and erase all that. Actually, we'll just comment it out. And what we'll do is we'll call var element, called element2, equals document.querySelector. And what we want to do is create a query selector that finds an element with an attribute ng-app. And that's exactly what we're doing here with these square brackets. We're saying find me an element, find me the first element with the attribute ng-app. Let's go ahead and save that, and we'll do console.log on the element2. And when we save it, and we see that we found the same element that we found before and everything underneath of it, and we found it by using our ng-app attribute. And obviously, once we have that element, we could say console.log, so we could see it, element2.getAttribute, and we know which attribute that is. It is ng-app. And if we save it, we'll see that we now can get at myTestApp. And once we have myTestApp, it certainly is very feasible for you to understand at this point that if you have some code, which is AngularJS code, that is declaring a module with myTestApp, I can marry these two very easily since I have a handle on the element that is responsible for that ng-app. And at that point, I would have a handle on the actual function that is responsible for the piece of content that is attached to this element 2. I'll mention one more quick thing in this lecture. There's a new set of custom attributes that HTML5 introduced, and those are called data-star attributes. And really these, unfortunately, really have nothing to do with this ng-app. You could go ahead and say data-, and that will be 100% compliant with the HTML5 specification. However, Angular does not require you to have that compliance. And you can look up in Google yourself what data-attribute-star actually means. It's just basically a much more convenient way at getting at custom attributes that hold custom data. But for AngularJS, just ng-app or ng something dash something really is good enough, and you don't need to use the new HTML5 data-star custom attribute setup.